Let me tell you a story about hope. But first, I need to tell you something about the main character in that story, me. I need to tell you something that I've never shared in public before. Something that's actually really difficult to share. I have depression. And sometimes, in fact, quite often, I feel like this. You're all alone. You're fat. You're ugly. You fail at everything. You need to be perfect. Why aren't you trying harder? Work harder. No one cares. You're a waste of space. You're a failure. You'll never make it. Everything's going wrong. I've had depression since I was 13. And sometimes I wanted to take that part of me that felt things so deeply and just rip it right out. I felt like the world was spinning out of control, and sometimes I just wanted to end it all. But that's not the story I'm here to tell you. I told you I want to tell you a story about hope. I wanted to find hope. I wanted to convince myself that there was a world out there worth believing in. One of the ways that I found joy in life was being able to inspire others and help them to find what they were passionate about. So I became a teacher, and I started teaching at a junior high school in Calgary. And I discovered that many of my students were in exactly the same place that I'd been at their age. I learned later that according to the World Health Organization, that almost 1 million people commit suicide every year. That's one death every 40 seconds. It's the second leading cause of death in the 10 to 24 years age group. That's the age group of my students. In fact, rates among young people have been increasing to such an extent that they are now the group at highest risk in a third of countries, both developed and developing. In Canada, 1 in 5 people suffers from a mental illness, with a cost to our economy of well in excess of $50 billion. But this wasn't just a statistic to me. These are my students that are struggling to find hope. My students who sit with me and who I talk to and listen to when they're depressed. It's my story. And if I didn't find a way to be able to help them, I was going to lose them in the same way that I'd almost been lost. Every year with my students, we start off the day by listening to that morning's news podcast. And every year, after 5 years of teaching, I realized that the same question would happen at some point during the year. One of my students would put up their hand and ask this question, usually on a news day that went something like this. There would be a hurricane in the East Coast, a shooting in a local neighborhood, economic collapse continuing, and, just to top it all off, a suicide bomber in the Middle East. They'd put up their hand and they would say, "Why does the world suck?" After years of responding to this question, I figured I needed to come up with a better way, because I didn't believe the media headline that if it bleeds, it should lead. In fact, one headline had even said that when historians looked back on our era, that we would be remembered as the age of anxiety. I didn't want to live in the age of anxiety. I wanted to create news for my students that would inspire them and break down barriers between people. It wasn't that I wanted to just eliminate all negative news. I wanted them to reframe that negative news. I wanted them to look for solutions, to look for stories of hope, to be audaciously optimistic. So I made a plan. I started a website. I decided that I would go to 9 countries over 7 months, finding inspiring people who were doing things to make their community better. It would be like a combo of art and storytelling. And I would be able to choose these destinations based on a variety of races, religions, regions, economic brackets, ages, so that we could each find someone who looked like us that was making a difference. I would post these videos up on my website along with other positive news, and of course I'd use social media to be able to spread it in as many ways as possible, because I was waging a war against negative news. And I believed that if I did all of these things, that it might just be possible to change the world. So I had the plan. That's where it gets tough. Everybody's got great ideas, right? Taking that first step forward, that's where it gets difficult. But I told myself I just had to do something. Maybe I wasn't the best ambassador for positive news. I mean, after all, I have depression. And sometimes I don't feel positive. Sometimes I just want to punch people. I've got red hair. And I was heading out into the complete unknown as a young woman traveling alone. But I didn't want to live in fear. I wanted to move forward in a spirit of hope. I wanted to inspire my students to believe that they could be women of courage in the face of difficulty. So I set off on my journey. When I arrived in Rwanda, I met my friend Stephen. When Stephen was still a child, his parents came home early one day and told him that they had to leave suddenly. He didn't know it at the time, but the Rwandan genocide had begun. They escaped from their house and fled into the forest, only to discover that his two older brothers had not made it there alive, and his sister and his grandmother were nowhere to be found. Stephen and his parents continued to flee, moving carefully to avoid being discovered. One day, while he was out looking for water for his family, he heard all sorts of yelling and commotion. He returned back to find that his parents had been killed, slashed to death by machetes. All alone, Stephen continued to hide, hiding out in swamps and breathing through a reed to avoid being seen. When the genocide finally ended, Stephen returned to his village. He had every reason to hate, every reason to be bitter. He had been left with nothing and no one. But Stephen decided to choose a different path. He decided he was going to reach out and heal his community. When he returned to his village, he invited members from both sides of the genocide, Hutus and Tutsis, to sit down with him and talk. And they knew that if he, a teenager who had lost everything, was willing to do it, that they could be courageous enough to join him. Slowly, his community began to reconcile. Stephen is one of the most courageous people I have ever met. Here was a story of hope in a country usually only known for its genocide. And yet I had found one person that had broken down that stereotype, one person we could learn from and be inspired by. And I learned that by telling a story, Stephen experienced healing, and I gained a new perspective. I learned that stories are universal, and I learned that there was at least one other person out there. I wasn't completely alone. There was another champion for hope. If Stephen could face everything he had and still be a person committed to peace and to hope, then I believe that I could continue my journey to tell positive stories. So everything was going awesome. I was collecting all sorts of great and inspiring news, and then I got typhoid. My bones felt as though there were metal plates pushing down on them, and so they were being crushed. I couldn't eat anything, and I struggled to keep in fluids. And I was so upset. I had come so far, and I'd worked so hard. And now I was going to have to give up on this whole plan. I was going to have to leave and go home early. And I still had 3 countries left, 3 countries that desperately needed to share positive news: Pakistan, Iran, and Israel. So I pushed on. I got a little bit healthier, and as soon as I could move, I continued my journey. When I arrived in Iran, I was greeted with smiles and tea everywhere I went. I drank more tea than I knew was humanly possible. Before I had left, many people in Canada had told me that I shouldn't go to Iran, that I would be bombed or attacked or the victim of a terrorist plot. But what I experienced was actually exactly the opposite. Iranians were so friendly, and they helped me time and time again. They even fixed my shoe. But that wasn't the only stereotype that many people in the West had of Iran. They painted a picture for me of women who were weak, docile, subjugated, in the shadow of men, faceless human beings without any power. What I experienced was a very different truth. As a rugby player, I had learned that there was a women's rugby team in Iran, and I was determined to meet them. I wanted to meet these women who had fought so hard to play the sport that they loved, and who had broken down all stereotypes of women in Iran as being weak. They had had to overcome many obstacles in order to play, since in order to play, they had to be dressed in hijab, which meant being covered head to toe. But these women were not faceless, and they certainly had a voice. When I arrived at the Iranian National Sports Federation, I was amazed to discover that Iran is actually leading the way in gender equity in sports, with equal number of male and female officiators, male and female coaches, and equal opportunities for athletes to tour. When I sat down with the women's rugby team, we laughed about the fact that when we all got dressed up in our uniforms and put all our gear on and were ready to play, we actually didn't look all that different. These women were not going to let an oppressive regime keep them down. They were not going to let a piece of cloth stand between them and their dreams. When I arrived in Israel, I met Joseph. Joseph has a beautiful view of an olive grove just outside of his restaurant. But when the partition was built to separate Palestine from Israel, it was built directly in front of his restaurant. It cut him off from the rest of the world. But Joseph decided to take this obstacle and turn it into something positive. He approached it first with a sense of humor by posting his menu on the wall. Next, with the World Cup coming up, he decided that he would take it one step further, and he projected the games onto the wall too. When I arrived, he was projecting movies onto the wall for customers, foreigners, locals, everyone. He'd found something that had been used to separate two people, and he had used it to bring people together. When I talked with Joseph, he told me that he believes one day, just like many Germans have a piece of the Berlin Wall sitting in their living room, that he will have a piece of that wall that is sitting right outside of his restaurant, sitting on his mantle, because he believes that one day Israel and Palestine will find a way to live in peace. All of these people, Stephen, the women's rugby team, and Joseph, none of them have won international awards. None of them are Nelson Mandela, nor do they need to be. They took the first step towards making a difference in their community. I believe there's a reason that we love these stories. It's the same reason that I love going to a movie where the underdog succeeds. Sometimes we just want to know that the good guy can win. Sometimes we need to know that it's possible. This realization I had about the power of sharing positive stories was so much larger than me. I'd collected 27 stories from all around the world, but that's not enough. It's not enough to save a generation. I needed to share it. I needed to send other people on the journey to collect positive stories and to fight the enemy of cynicism, fear, futility, and suicide. That's why I came here. I need your help. We need to convince everyone we know to start sharing positive news. You could be that storyteller. You just have to start calling yourself a storyteller. We all share positive stories every day. We share stories. That's what we do. We're humans, right? Now you have the choice to choose which stories will you repeat, or what angle or perspective will you choose to tell them from. Now, I know some of you may not feel like you are all cut out to be ambassadors of hope, but let me entice you. You are what you repeatedly do. When you start sharing positive stories, you will become more positive. You will choose peace over punching people. You will choose laughter instead of feeling overwhelmed. And you will choose hope instead of fear. But most importantly, you have the opportunity to be able to change someone else's perspective. You have the power to be able to help someone's load become a little bit lighter, to help change the way that they look at their day, and to help them see the world through a different lens. I told you a story today that allowed you to reframe how you saw me. You could have just seen me as a woman with depression, but I am not a victim of depression. That same part of me that makes me feel sometimes as though I am all alone in this world, beat down, crushed, and defeated, also has an amazing side. That same part allows me to feel things deeply. It allows me to create and to feel joy and to believe passionately that the world could be better. The world could choose to see me just as a woman with depression, but I hope that you've seen through my story today that I am not depressed. I'm a champion for hope, and I would not have chosen to have been born any other way. You all know at least one person in your life that is making a change. You can all think of someone that you've heard of or that maybe you know personally that is making a difference. If you share that story with even one person, you are a storyteller. And you are an ambassador for hope. Be storytellers. Because together, we can create positive news and we can fight the enemy of cynicism, fear, futility, and suicide. And we can emerge as no longer the age of anxiety, but the age of hope. This is a story without an ending, because you must choose your own adventure. What ending will you write?